The non-conference games this year are no joke. What is the worst case scenario for Minnesota? And could Gable Steveson really leave?
Hey,
You are Locked On Golden Gophers.
No matter what we're going to do here, we're just going to keep rowing.
Your daily podcast on the Minnesota
Whatever
Golden
turns out,
Gophers.
However it turns out, we're just going to keep rowing.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
We're just going to keep rowing, and keep rowing.
You're listening to the Locked On Golden Gophers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name's Kane Rob, host of the podcast, former collegiate football video coordinator and recruiting assistant, here to talk Golden Gophers with you each and every day of the week. And it is almost each and every day of the week. This is the final week where we're doing 3 days a week. Next week, we kick it off back to Monday through Friday. So do not miss out on any of the Gophers content. I've got shows planned out from now until the very first kickoff, so you're not going to want to miss it. Next week, we are going to start diving in on behind enemy lines and getting a deep dive on every single one of the Gophers' opponents and what could happen, who to be on the lookout for, and so much more. So we're going to talk about each and every single game on the schedule. Then we'll start to dive into the positional groups and get more into the depth chart after that. You're not going to want to miss any of it. Hit follow over on anywhere you find your podcast at Locked On Golden Gophers, and then go over to YouTube, hit subscribe, join in, jump in the comments, let me know your thoughts, let me know which games are the worries for you, and so much more. But let's talk about some of the hard things to talk about today with the Gophers. The worst case scenario with Minnesota. What is the ugliest it could get in 2023? Then I want to talk about the non-conference schedule. And then finally, we got to talk about Gable Steveson, because there's a lot of rumors between Iowa and Minnesota, and he's kind of amping it up. So let's talk about, could that really happen? We'll get there, but let's talk about the worst case scenario for Minnesota when it comes to football this season. Now, yesterday we talked about what will happen, or what happens if the Gophers win the West. We talked about the scenario that would need to take place and everything that would need to follow, what it likely means happened in the season if the Gophers won the West. Today we're taking the opposite approach. What is the absolutely worst case realistic scenario? I mean, obviously you'd say, well, the worst case scenario is they don't win a single game. Yeah, no duh. But what is the more likely thing to happen? What is the worst case scenario? And there's two viable options, in my opinion. The first one is the very, very worst case. I think the Gophers only win 5 games, tied for the worst record in Coach Fleck's time with the Gophers. Now, when you're looking at the schedule itself, there's a lot of games that present a challenge. We've talked about North Carolina. We've talked about Michigan, Ohio State. Those 3 games are kind of the headliners of the schedule. Then you've got your 2 main rivalry games with Iowa and Wisconsin, which is always a toss-up. That's 5 games right there. But if it was the worst case scenario, that likely means the Gophers go 5-7. So what are the other potential losses that could happen in a worst case scenario? Well, I think Illinois has presented challenges for the past 2 years now. You haven't been able to get over that hump. I do think the Gophers will switch that up this year, but if they don't, if that front seven, that nasty front seven with one of the best defensive linemen in the entire nation in Newton, just gets to the quarterback time after time, and Ethan can't get out of the pressure, the offensive line can't hold up, I could see Illinois running away with it. I could see them scrapping out a win. So that could be a potential loss. Nebraska could be a potential loss in game 1 if the Gophers come in underestimating them, if Jeff Sims takes a ginormous leap forward and is able to pass the ball more accurately and doesn't turn the ball over as often and uses his athleticism to his advantage. Maybe Eric Gilbert, the tight end, gets cleared, gets to the waiver to play and goes absolutely ballistic. Maybe Anthony Grant turns into that Big Ten, all Big Ten type running back. There's different ways that could go. And if Minnesota sleeps, if they don't wake up, if they don't come ready to play, if they don't click from the jump, that could end up a loss. So there's that kind of leeway, that little sway. Now, if it wasn't Nebraska, you still have Michigan State. If Michigan State comes out and returns to Mel Tucker's first official full season with them, and they get a 10-11 win type season because their new quarterback steps up, or the Jalen Berger turns into the next version of Kenneth Walker. I mean, these are a bit extreme in my estimation. I don't think they're very likely. It's more likely that the game is closer or the Gophers find a way to get it done. I mean, we're talking about Michigan State last year, who just lost its quarterback from last year, lost its top 2 receiving, maybe even top 3 receiving options from last year, lost some big players on the defense, and Minnesota beat them 49-7 or 34-7, 34-7 in their house, in their territory, in East Lansing. So those aren't things I'm counting on, but it could happen. So that's kind of where that worst case scenario comes. And if it's only 5 wins, that means you've lost to every rival. That means each trophy game that you have on the season is no longer in Minnesota. That means no bowl game in the season. And I think the Minnesota fan base would turn off of that season and be extremely negative. The offseason might be unbearable from the negative Gopher fans, the negative Minnesota fans that have experienced hurt and pain so often in their lives, Vikings fans who have 13-4 seasons and then lose in the first round of the playoffs, Twins fans that can't get out of the play-in game or the shorter series playoffs, the Wild who keep getting bounced in the first round, even though it feels like the year with a true talent like Kirill Kaprizov, the Timberwolves who can't get out of the play-in or the first round and can't get past it, even though they have Cat and Anthony Edwards, and now they brought in a third All-Star in Rudy Gobert. Minnesota's experienced a lot of pain, and I just know if they took a non-bowl game season, even in a difficult schedule, the fan base would be restless. So hopefully that won't happen, but I see that as the very, very worst case scenario. The second viable option is that Minnesota gets 6 wins and gets a bowl game, but it's still a disappointment. Either way, it would likely mean the season, this is what happens to head to the worst case scenario. The season is chock full of miscommunications on the defensive side of things, on the offensive side of things. Probably the offensive line can't hold up is an issue that we'd probably experience if it went to the worst case scenario. The defense can't find an identity, whether that be on the pass rush, whether that be on the secondary side, whether it be on turnovers, whether it be the defense will not have found an identity if we hit the worst case. That is very likely what would happen. On top of that, like I said, miscommunications, chock full. There'd probably be a lot of turnovers. We talked about how there's probably going to be more turnovers this season than we've maybe had in the past couple because Ethan's still getting a feel for things. Now, I could be wrong there. Maybe he clicks from the jump. I would love that. I would love it. But I think there's going to be, like I said, more explosive plays, more shot plays in this offense, which means you also could have more turnover-worthy plays. So if the worst case happens, it's probably because there were a lot more turnovers, miscommunications, offensive line can't hold up, defense can't find an identity, lack of a passing game, which I find hard to believe. But again, this is the worst case. And then finally, injuries. If there are a ton of injuries rampaged across this team, it's hard to stay afloat no matter how hard you're rowing the boat. So overall, that's probably what it would mean to have in the absolute worst case scenario. Most of those reasons that I said, the miscommunications, the turnovers, the lack of a passing game, the offensive line can't hold up, defense can't find an identity. All of those things are self-inflicted. Now, turnovers, maybe not. Maybe they're just hard-earned turnovers. Maybe it's someone jumping the route at perfect timing. Maybe it's someone absolutely punching the ball out to the point where nobody could have held on to it. But outside of turnovers, outside of injuries, there isn't a massive talent gap in the division. There isn't a massive talent gap in the West. So it would mean a lot of self-inflicted injuries if Minnesota saw the worst case scenario. Now, Minnesota should stay in a vast majority of its games. It should have a chance in a lot of its games. The likely outcome is somewhere between the 2 times we've talked about. Yesterday, we talked about what happens if they win the West. Today, we talked about the worst case scenario. The likely scenario, the likely outcome is somewhere in the middle of that, somewhere between. Maybe it's a 7-win season. Maybe it's an 8-win season, but you still don't get the division. I think it's somewhere in there, but there's still an outcome out there that Minnesota finishes with 8 wins. It's 3rd in the division, but it could still be a maybe successful season. A disappointment still because you want to get to the Big Ten championship. But again, I see this season as a precursor, a challenge for the young roster that we have and getting so much needed experience for the guys like Ethan Kelly McManus, for some of the receivers that are more going to be here for another year or two, for an extremely young running back room, for an offensive line that has some huge young depth to it. This is the perfect season for them to get their feet under them and to head into 2024 and 2025 with some nasty experience, with some absolute ready to play guys and know what it takes in the offseason to get to the next stage. So that is why this season is huge, no matter what happens with the results. But I want to talk about our non-conference coming up next, because Minnesota absolutely blew the non-conference games out of the water last season. And I wouldn't expect that exact same result heading into the 2023 season. We'll talk about why coming up next. First, let's talk about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs, because these days every new hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business, and you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. They help find the right people for you faster and for free. And you know, when I'm looking for jobs, anytime I've ever looked for a job, it's always been over at LinkedIn, because it's so easy to navigate, but also you can see who's looking for work, who's not, who's hiring, and all of that. So you can add a job, add your job, then add a purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. On top of that, it's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading candidates. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find qualified candidates that you want to talk to even faster, and you can post about your job for free over at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post about your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Gophers fans, thank you so much for listening to Locked On Golden Gophers and making us your first listen when it comes to Gophers daily sports. Now, like I said, in the future, next week, we're talking behind enemy lines. We're breaking every single episode. We're breaking down a new opponent for the upcoming schedule. But the next episode you'll hear this week, we're going to talk about impact freshmen and who could be ready for the 2023 season to play from the jump. So don't miss that and become a subscriber every single day. Now, let's talk about realistic expectations for this non-conference schedule, because last year in 2022, the Gophers won their non-conference games by an average of 40 points. That's right, 4-0. They were absolutely whooping these non-conference opponents, and that's why everybody was trying to say, oh, they haven't played anybody. They haven't done it. Their non-conference is a cupcake, blah, blah, blah. Look, go look at that SEC almost every single season, and you'll see cupcake schedules with their non-conference. I don't want to hear all that, but Minnesota did what it needed to do against those non-conference opponents. In New Mexico State, they won 38-0. Now, New Mexico State ended up winning a bowl game last year. They went 6-6, and they won a bowl game, 0 P5 wins, but they still had a somewhat successful year in their first year with Coach Kill. Then you look at Western Illinois. Okay, yes, I'll admit it. That game was a cupcake game, and it went on to show Minnesota won 62-10, and those 3 of the points came in the first half, at the end of the first half on a field goal, but the other touchdown was scored in like the final 2 or 3 minutes of the game. So it was 62-3 at the end of the game until the very end on some garbage time touchdown. But Western Illinois went 0-11 last year, and a majority of their games were against FCS opponents. So yes, that game was indeed a cupcake. I'll give it to you. But then you go over to a P5 school in Colorado who absolutely was not very good last year. It caused all their coaches to get fired. It caused Deion Sanders to come into the building. It caused Deion Sanders to bring only, 40 players with him now, because people don't want to play there because of how he handled things or something like that. We'll see. You know what? They've got some top talent over there in Colorado. We'll see if they can get a better or a better result. We'll see if they can get to maybe a bowl game. And if they do, then people are going to have to give them a little bit of respect. But last year, Minnesota beat Colorado 49-7. Colorado went 1-11 with only one win against Cal in overtime. And Cal was a 4-8 team, so it's not like Cal was the best of the best either. Alas, the non-conference games last year were easy. The Minnesota held it down. They did what they're supposed to do. They won by an average of 40 points. But in 2023, that isn't going to be the same case. These teams are a lot better. regardless of if Eastern Michigan and Louisiana Lafayette don't put fear into your soul, that's okay. But you can't sleep on them either. Eastern Michigan went 9-4 last year with a bowl win. They beat Arizona State, who was a P5 opponent. They also beat Western Michigan, who had Corey Crooms, who had Sean Tyler, who are now with the Gophers. On top of that, then after an Eastern Michigan challenge in week 2, you move on to another non-conference in North Carolina, at North Carolina, who went 9-5 last year. They won their division in the ACC. They started out the season 9-1. They have a Heisman candidate quarterback. That's a challenge. It is. And a lot of people aren't taking that one for granted. But North Carolina did lose 4 of their final games last season. On top of, they were in some scraps, some late games all the way in the beginning with their non-conference, with Appalachian State and other teams in there as well. So even though they started out 9-1, they had no ranked wins on the season. So there's still possibility there, but it is definitely more of a challenge. Then finally, you've got Louisiana Lafayette. They went 6-7 last year. They got to a bowl game, lost that bowl game to Houston by 1 touchdown. Houston wasn't bad on the year last year. Clayton Tune leading the way there, but they had no Power 5 wins. And in 2021, they were 13-1. So Louisiana Lafayette is, again, a program you don't want to sleep on. 13-1 2 years ago. Last year, they got to a bowl game and gave a challenge to a Houston program that was not a bad program at all. So all of this is to say that Gophers fans should not sleep on this year's non-conference opponents. Now, I don't think anyone is sleeping on North Carolina, but it's also a winnable game. I'm not going to say you should fear that game. You should look forward to that challenge. I think the Gophers defense can prove themselves early in that game, saying, look, Heisman or no Heisman, we're going to play defense and we're going to show you that we are capable. And I look forward to that game. It's one of my favorite games on the schedule. But we'll dive in deeper next week when we take a look at the opponent breakdowns each day of the week. So there'll be Wednesday of next week where we'll dive into North Carolina. But Eastern Michigan and Louisiana Lafayette are capable opponents. Don't sleep on them, respect them. But in the end, regardless, this more difficult non-conference schedule should be better for the Gophers. It should offer up, the bigger challenge should offer up opportunities for the Gophers to benefit from it, because Minnesota will have more difficult games in these non-conferences. Minnesota will probably play closer games in this non-conference. You know what that means? It means that your starters are on the field longer, getting more experience and putting themselves in more situational football opportunities that will arise in the later season when it matters. When you go to Hawkeye Stadium, when you go to Ohio State, you're going to have situations where it can make or break the game, and your starters being in longer and getting more experience will help this Gophers team, because this team, unlike last year, the non-conference was great for the young guys to get opportunities and get on the field early and get some play action. This year, those young guys are starters, and this will be the perfect opportunity for them to get more experience against an opponent that they should beat. There isn't resting the starters as much in these games. It's getting out there and getting more experience. And that's why these harder non-conference opponents are better for this Gophers team. It's a no night off mentality, and that is perfect for the Gophers heading into the 2023 season. Now, the final thing we're going to talk about today is Gable Steveson. You know who he is. He's an all-time Gophers wrestler, world champion, absolute domination. But could he be headed to Iowa? And would that ruin his legacy here with the Gophers? Let's talk about it to wrap up the show. All right, Gophers fans, let's talk about Gable Steveson. Could he be ruining his legacy if he takes his final year of eligibility and transfers to Iowa? Now, we all got the news recently that Gable Steveson wants to come back to the college days, to the college experience of wrestling, and give it one more go to be an absolute national champion. But it's not 100% confirmed he'll come back to Minnesota. In fact, he has 1 year of eligibility. He could go anywhere. But it seems like he's down to Minnesota and Iowa. That's right, Iowa, the Hawkeyes, the team that some folks hate the most. Some folks hate the second most. Could he truly leave to go to a rival? And the thing is, he's been tweeting out things like he'll tweet out an emoji of a bird with a question mark. Then he'll tweet an emoji with an M and a question mark. Then he'll tweet out pictures of him when he was younger in an Iowa t-shirt, or him practicing in an Iowa gym for whatever he was practicing in at the time with one of their coaches. Then he'll tweet out a picture of him dominating in a Minnesota uniform. And so it's just like, he's playing a couple games, folks, but it's also getting him some social interaction and building up the following around him and what he is going to do. He's pulling a LeBron in my cards. I've got nothing but love and respect for LeBron, but some of the things LeBron does is absolutely dramatic, and it gets the eyes on him. That's what it seems like Gable is doing right now. Now, would Iowa, going to the rival, going to a team that people absolutely hate from Minnesota after you've won championships, after you've been such a dominant force, could it make people in Minnesota, could it ruin your legacy? Now, I don't think it could outright destroy his legacy. Nobody would be like, oh, I hate Gable. I wish he never would have came here. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, you'll probably get one or two people like that, but the majority of the fan base is pretty reasonable. They're not going to be like, oh, I hate this dude. But it might leave a little foul taste. You know, when people are talking about the GOATs of Minnesota wrestling and talking about the top of the top, a lot of those guys didn't leave to go to the rivals. So then when Gable's name comes up, maybe it could take a back seat to some of those guys because he left for the rival. Now, that would hurt a little bit. It would be a punch in the mouth, a gut punch for Minnesota fans. But there's some speculation on why he would maybe choose Iowa. Some people are talking about the WWE might be pushing him that way because Iowa's one of the top programs in wrestling right now, and it could also build his fan base in the Midwest because he's already got Minnesota, and then Iowa, if he grows that, he could really dominate the Midwest, and people would be pulling for him everywhere. Look, that sounds reasonable. I mean, it does sound like a potential reason why he would go to Iowa. Now, it would stink for Gophers fans because, of course, we want to keep him here and keep the domination going. Another option people said is NIL. Well, like Iowa has better NIL. They have more opportunities. Look at Caitlin Clark, blah, 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 blah. Look, everybody's still kind of growing in that NIL space. Iowa's got a step or two in front of Minnesota, but it's not night and day, the difference in NIL between Iowa and Minnesota right now. Now, yes, they might have more boosters chipping in or whatever, what have you, but I don't think it's an absurd difference between the two schools and where they're at with NIL right now. And then when you're talking about Caitlin Clark, look, basketball is a sport that it has more eyes on it. So I can't imagine, regardless of how great of a wrestler, regardless of how much of a legend of a wrestler Gable Steveson is, I can't see him as a top 2, top 3 NIL producer for the Iowa Hawkeyes. I still think football player like Cade McNamara or one of the best football players on their team, the quarterback or somebody, a featured player, is probably seeing more NIL coming through. A couple of those football players probably are. On top of that, Caitlin Clark, she's got deals with Nike. She's got deals all over. So I wouldn't put him way at the tippy top, but he probably is in that next tier of athletes who could get NIL. So it could be a step up, but we don't know. And his name could offer sponsorships and things like that. But again, we don't know the final details on that. But overall, those are two reasons on why maybe he could be considering Iowa. Now, Iowa fans have shown out on those social posts, the ones I was talking about, the bird or the M, the older pictures or the one in his Minnesota uniform. Look, Iowa fans have been showing out. They've been showing love. They've been begging him to come, hands and knees, begging. If he's looking to build his followers, if he's looking for someone to really raise him up and see him as a generational hero of sorts in that sport, look, they've been showing love, and I've got to give credit where credit's due. So Minnesota fans, we got to get out there and show the love too if you really want him to stay home. But you know what? If he did leave for the Iowa Hawkeyes, it would be a bit sad. It's like thinking about if Mo Ibrahim would have had one more year of eligibility this year. And he absolutely dominated, set the records, set the rushing records and everything like that this past season. Should have been a Doak Walker finalist in my opinion, but just missed the finalist cut. Proved as a Big Ten, all Big Ten running back in 2020, even put his name in the conversation this past year. If Mo Ibrahim absolutely dominated last year, put up over 200 yards rushing on Iowa last year, if he had 1 year of eligibility left and he said, you know what, I'm thinking about transferring to Iowa, I'd be sick. I don't know what I would do. And I feel like that's what some fans, some wrestling fans and others would have that same taste in their mouth if Gable Steveson was going to transfer to Iowa. That's kind of how I see it. It's not like Jamison Battle, who ended up transferring to Ohio State, again, most likely for NIL opportunities, most likely to try to get more eyes on him to get to the pros. It's not quite the same because Ohio State isn't a true rival. And one could argue Jamison Battle wasn't as big of a face of the Minnesota program, of the university as a whole, as Gable Steveson in the dominance that he showed in wrestling. So it's not the same. That's why the Mo analogy is a bit better. And if Mo went to Iowa, we would be having a fit. We'd be throwing ourselves off of a bridge. It's a phrase. I didn't mean that literally, but you get what I'm saying. People would be absolutely heartbroken. So overall, I don't know. I don't know what he's going to do. My gut says he would stay here and keep that legacy going. And he knows that Minnesota fans would show out and show up. But I can't say for sure. We're going to have to stay tuned. We're going to have to stay posted. But that's going to do it for us here at Locked On Golden Gophers. I hope you enjoyed the show. Let me know what you think below. Would going to Iowa hurt his reputation? Are you afraid of the non-cons? Are you excited by the non-cons? And on top of that, what is the worst case scenario for the Gophers football program in your opinion? I will see you later this week. We're going to talk impact freshmen for the Gophers, who could be playing in this upcoming season. That and more. Row the boat, Sky Go Gophers. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.